recently we've seen several videos on the internet addressing the concern of high rates of fertility among the Islamic immigrants coming to Europe, showing essentially how if you have a small population with a very high birth rate, and a larger population with lower birth rates, the smaller population will eventually overtake the larger population, which makes mathematical sense and sounds like that might indeed be concerning to have Muslim majorities all throughout the Western world. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of the actual math that is shown here. So here we can see that if we look at France with about 63 million Frenchmen and about 5 million Muslims, if they are reproducing at 8.1 children per woman for the immigrants and only 1.8 children for the French, we can see that sure enough, the Islamic population, somewhere in around 45 years, 42 years or so here, will go ahead and overtake the French population and continue to shoot upwards and onwards all the way up to 750 million people. Wow, 750 million, that's twice the size of the entire United States for only the Muslim population in France. That's pretty high. So are these numbers correct? Are they really producing at 8.1 children per woman as the video shows? Well, the video doesn't cite any type of source or research that it has gotten that number from. So let's go ahead and look at some of the actual data that has been collected by research organizations like Pew Research. For one here, we can see that it has shown that the fertility rate among Muslims to non-Muslims in Europe is actually 2.1. So that's totally different. And that's Pew Research, which is one of the leading research organizations in the entire world that has a long history of excellent methodology in aggregating statistics. But we can indeed see that Muslims typically are producing at higher rates than non-Muslim populations. We can see that worldwide, and especially in sub-Saharan Africa, you're at 5.2 children for Muslims and 4.2 children for non-Muslims in those countries. So maybe somebody in Europe in one of their institutions knows a little bit better. So we have Stephen Seifert, head of the Department of Immigration and Labor Market at the Berlin Institute for Population and Development. He said among migrant women alone, the birth rate was 1.95 women per children. Also dramatically lower than anything that was shown there as well. So we can take a look and see the primary countries that immigrants are coming from into France that are Islamic is Algeria and Morocco, which has a birth rate of about 2.38 children per woman, also way lower than what this video shows. In fact, no country in the entire world has a birth rate of 8.1 children per woman. So let's go ahead and take a look and see how it really looks if we use some of the actual data collected by Pew Research. So let's say that it's about 2.1 as Pew Research would indicate. Well, now we get a totally different story here, don't we? Now let's say Pew Research is actually wrong. Let's say it's even worse than we thought. Let's say it's 1.5 for France, and let's say those Muslims really are just having a ton of kids. Let's say it's 3.5. So you can see that even if the institutions and the research was pretty wrong, you still over the course of 100 years, the next century, which is 83 years from now, the year 2100, you still only get a 30% population and 70% European population in France. So that's a big problem that the numbers just don't add up with this video. Now, another big problem with this video is something that we can see that reliably happens over time, which is the fact that birth rates are continually trending downward. That's in the first world and even in the third world as well too. So we can see here that if you look at the worldwide average, you look at Africa, look at Asia, more developed countries, which more developed countries had a lower birth rate anyways, but it's still gone downwards. And then impoverished countries, which was very high, have really trended downward much more significantly. So we can see a prediction for the future here. Some people think the first world birth rates might go up a little bit, but we can see the less developed regions have had very high birth rates of around 5 to 6 children per woman in the past that have taken a steeper decline downwards. So as we can see that it's not very reliable that birth rates will stay high. So even if you look at Iran, the Islamic Republic, they used to have birth rates up around 7 per women, and then that's come all the way down here. Even Ghana, which was pretty high, has dropped all the way down to about 4 children per woman from up around 7. And Germany was already pretty low, but now it's clearly much lower. So let's go ahead and factor that into the equation, which is obviously pretty important. So as these birth rates go down in the third world, they lose about 0.08 per year from their growth rate. And so if you factor that in, well, then you see something's very different here. But let's say it doesn't even decline down quite that much. Let's say it's more of the decline the first world saw of 0.35. So it looks very unimpressive. Now that's even if you had crazy high numbers, like let's say they came over with a rate of 5 children per woman and kept that for a little while. You know, that trend downwards still takes a toll and just levels it off. And that's at the first world decline rates. If you look at the third world decline rates of 0.08, well, and then it comes down, and after a while, they start looking like the Europeans. So how do we know birth rates come down, and what makes us think they definitely will come down? Well, we can see one of the biggest factors with birth rates is the childhood mortality rate. If you know that there's a good chance that some of your kids are going to die, well, you're much more inclined to have more kids. You want to have some backup kids. You love your kids. It'd be horrible to have a kid die, and you want your kids to be around, so you're probably just going to have more kids if you have a higher childhood mortality rate. Also, we can see another big factor is poverty. When you just don't have a lot else to do with your life, you don't have a lot of opportunity, education, career development, security, infrastructure, welfare. Well, you want to have a lot more kids because they're fulfilling. They make you happy. It's something to do with your time. They also take care of you when you get older. They're like free employees, and they also might have some security benefits for you as well too. Also, education is hugely important. If you have prospects of going out and starting a career and doing what you want in the world, well, then you don't focus on having kids as much. But if you can't have any career or education, well, you kind of do what you're good at, which is have a whole bunch of kids. And so we can see that as you make these improvements to demographics, the birth rates always come down. So let's take a look here in Europe in general and say, let's say even if you had 10,000 immigrants coming into France for the next 83 years, or let's say even 100,000, okay, 100,000 immigrants per year coming in, well, you still don't see you're still at 17% Muslim at the end of the century, and let's say your high birth rates of 5 children per woman, still just doesn't come down that much. Then you might have a bigger problem here. Then you really might close the gap if you're flooding in lots of immigrants. They have extremely high birth rates, and the birth rates don't really come down very much. Then, as we can see, that population can really start to expand with the declining European population. But in reality, based on the actual research, on the higher end, you're probably closer to like 2.5, and let's say the 2.5 doesn't even decline, it stays steady, and you have 100,000 immigrants coming in every single year, that's you still can only get to a maximum of 30% there. And realistically, you're probably not going to have 100,000 immigrants coming in every year. So let's see, you do more like 10,000. Well, then what do you end up with here? You only end up with 17% of the population. And so nevertheless, it's definitely growing. I mean, that's a larger population than you have today, which is 17%. And then if you say, let's say the European birth rates go down a little bit as well too, let's say they go down to 1.1, well, then you can see, it falls even further, and you have an even larger gap here between the two, which is 23% Muslim at the end of the century. Now you can look at Germany, Germany has about 76 million native and about 6.2 million Muslims. So you see the same thing here. Let's say they even have a fertility rate of 3 per woman, and the German rate is that should be about 1.3. Okay, and then let's say this curves down just a little bit here, just a little downward curve over time. Well, then you still have a pretty huge difference at the end of the century, and this is even a longer time period than the video showed. So as you can see, the math is just not adding up with what the video shows. It's totally contradicted by the actual numbers, even when we try to factor in a lot of different variables here. So in Europe, you have a population of about, I think, 750 million, with about 50 million Muslims. So how's that looking for Europe? So even if you had a 4.5% fertility rate among Muslims, well, it would certainly go upward a little bit more, but as Pew Research shows, you really have about a 1.6 fertility rate among Europeans. And so no matter what you do here, I mean, the gap is continually closing. Let's even say another 100,000 refugees or immigrants come in per year. That doesn't even make a huge difference. You could even say 200,000 still is not making a huge difference, especially if these birth rates normalize. Then it just they start looking like Europeans pretty instantly, and you don't have, and you end up with only a 6% Muslim population by the end of the year. So how do you make these birth rates actually come down? How do you keep them down? And then how do you reduce the religious fundamentalism and some of these negative attributes that you might not want to see be exaggerated in these Muslim populations? Where, as we can see, the biggest thing to get birth rates down is education, it's economic opportunity, it's infant mortality rate. All of these things should improve as they integrate into European society. Now, naturally, if we don't want them to integrate in very well to European society, and they don't, and they stay in these isolated, religiously homogenous, cultural enclaves, then they may retain higher birth rates, higher rates of religious fundamentalism. So the best thing you can possibly do is have integration. These monotheistic religious beliefs are very corrosive to external contradicting ideas. They're easily corroded and sensitive to those ideas because these monotheistic religious beliefs are based on absolutes, saying only my God, only our way of doing things. We have the one true God, the one system that works. And so when you're around a whole bunch of other people that have a great system that really works for them as well, and they're happy and prosperous, it's kind of hard to maintain your argument that only your system works. People start scratching their head, which is one reason why you see some of these far-right conservative religious Christian groups in Europe also don't like other religions coming in because their monotheism is also sensitive to competing ideas. So if we're concerned about the economic status of Europe in these populations that really are trending downwards, we can see pretty clearly here that if you get anywhere below 2 kids per woman, your population is going to trend downward, and that does have some real economic issues for society. Now, it doesn't mean that you're in a matter of years, your society is going to disappear like the video says. As you can see, at a 1.9 rate, you still have a moderate downward trend where you lose about 60,000 people over the next, or I'm sorry, 60 million people over the next century. And even if you're at 1.1, then you come, a lot further down here and you lose a lot more people. But nevertheless, you still have, 400, 320, 350 million people there. But nevertheless, that is an economic problem. It's hard to have a consumption-driven society when you have a huge decline like that. Not to mention you have a lot of elderly people and less kids producing products and services that can, or in tax revenue that can support the aging population. And so if you want these immigrants to come in and kind of fill in that gap and have an economic contribution, you want to reduce their birth rates over time, you want to reduce rates of religious fundamentalism, well, the best thing you can do is focus on their education, their career, their development, their stability, their integration within, greater society and social connectiveness with other people, and that's within everybody's interest to do that. Now, if these European countries don't necessarily want to flood in huge amounts of immigrants because there are short-term costs to bringing them in, you have higher crime rates, you have higher rates of welfare usage, which is probably a net loss for these countries at the beginning. It may take till the second generation of these immigrants before they start becoming an actual economic asset, not a net liability. They're actually contributing more to the economy than their welfare is taking out of the system. These immigrants have, they don't speak the native language very well, and they are unskilled. Okay, it's hard for them to have a great contribution, but when the second generation and their kids are born into these societies, well, that can really be economically viable and can offset some of the big problems that you really do have with a declining population like this. So if these countries simply don't want to take in more immigrants, well, that's totally up to them if you don't like those short-term costs. That's why you have a democracy, so you can decide on what you want and don't want, because you have terrorist attacks with these Muslim immigrants, and that has a large psychological weight on society, more than just the small body count. You have higher crime rates, higher sexual assaults. These are real costs for these people in these societies to really consider, and in some insane Islamic calls of theocracy and Sharia law that is just really icky to see. It's just kind of emotionally repulsive. No one wants that. Okay, and so it's kind of up to them if we don't want to help these people in the third world, where in, let's say, Syria, you have 300,000 people dying in this civil war. In these horrible problems of poverty. If you just don't want to bring those people in, you don't think that it's a great solution to poverty or helping these countries to bring them into the West, which it definitely might not be, then that's kind of up to us. These countries can decide what they want to do. But what we need to realize, as far as the immigrants that are in the country, you probably can't get rid of those. There's not much you can really do with them. There's only one thing to do with them, which is try to develop that demographic, try to integrate it and have them contribute to your society in the long run. Now, if we're worried about religious fundamentalism, which is a genuine concern with some of these demographics, we can see that the biggest thing that's going to affect that would be poverty. You see that poverty has a direct correlation with religiosity. Well, not a direct correlation, but a pretty heavy correlation to it. When people just don't have very much going on, they don't have very much to do, they don't have very much opportunity, well, they prefer to focus on the afterlife. They prefer to get some type of emotional gratification from the spiritual experience and imagining how great things are going to be, and getting some sense of security of believing that your deity is helping you and protecting you. Also, we can see education and IQ correlates very heavy with religiosity. People with lower IQ are going to be more religious. So education is a great thing to focus on here, and we can even see a little bit more directly here that Even as conservatism goes up, education will go down. And then we can also see Muslims born into these European and Western societies have much lower rates of religious fundamentalism. So here we can see a survey done here that asks about suicide bombing, and as we can see, Muslims born in America and Germany have say it's almost never justifiable compared to some of these heavily homogenous Muslim majority countries, Jordan and Egypt, where you have a much lower percentage saying that. And so we can see it really does have a strong effect. Some studies also show that Muslims born in America, about 32% of them no longer embrace Islam in their older life. So these people really can integrate in with society. It just really takes time. And by time, I mean not like a year or two, but closer to decades to a few decades to have multiple generations. And we can really create this equilibrium of thought in the world, which really does make the world a better place. But that's not to say there still aren't definitely short-term concerns with bringing in some of these immigrants. It's kind of up to these countries to decide if they want to do that. But there is certainly no reason to create just irrational, fake math to produce ridiculous propaganda about these Muslims just taking over all of Western society in a short time period based on these reproduction rates, which clearly has no potential to truthfully happen in real life.